When most people think of New Jersey, they think of things like Taylor Ham, video game reviewers on YouTube, smog, and slasher movies. Now, since Taylor Ham cost an arm and a leg to ship cross country, and global warming is a worldwide issue, let's just stick to the horror movies, and we're going to start off with one of the best franchises out there, Friday the 13th. And I'm going to cover each of these movies one by one and give my own take on how the story plays out, so let's just jump right into it. Friday the 13th is a story about a group of carefree young adults that are put in a situation where they're completely isolated from the rest of civilization, where they're picked off one by an unseen killer. It's a well-known fact that the formula was ripped off from Halloween to cash in on the buzz that was created. The movie starts off at Camp Crystal Lake in the year 1958, and right off the bat, two people are murdered, and suddenly we jump to present day, and they really could have just been honest here and said it was 1980. Especially since a Friday the 13th actually happened that year in June, which would have made perfect sense for a summer camp opening. A young girl named Annie is walking through town, trying to figure out how to get to Camp Crystal Lake, and the town's residents are all pretty skeptical at the prospect of the camp actually reopening.
Camp Blood, they're opening that place again?
A truck driver offers to give her a ride halfway, where she's stopped by a local booze bag named Crazy Ralph.
God damn it, Ralph, get out of here. Go on, get! Leave people alone!
He tells her the camp has a death curse.
It's got a death curse.
Oh, shut up, Ralph.
During the course of the ride, the truck driver tells Annie about a boy who drowned in 1957, and then he brings up the murder that we saw in the prologue, and that every time they tried to reopen the camp, it was stopped because of several fires, and one year they tried to reopen, the water was bad. Eventually, the owners wound up completely bankrupt, and she should just quit her job and go home, and Annie, being the smartass that she is, completely blows them off.
Lisa, I'm not afraid of ghosts.
I always wondered how the hell the water could be bad. I mean, when I was a kid, it always made me think of the swamp that drains your health from Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. Meanwhile, we're introduced to the rest of the cast. You got Ned the resident prankster, along with Marcy and her boyfriend Jack, who's played by a very young Kevin Bacon, arriving at the camp where they meet Steve Christie, the son of the original owners. Then they meet Alice Hardy, who has some history with Steve, Bill, who seems to have some history with Alice, and Brenda, who has no history with anybody. I love the 80s. There are two other stars of the movie, but we never get to see them. Now, Halloween showed a minimal amount of blood, and the violence was all implied. Meanwhile, Friday the 13th had Tom Savini, who's undoubtedly the king of horror FX. His work on the film gave us bloody and elaborate kills that looked unbelievably realistic and shocking for the time. Combine that with Harry Manfredini's music score, which is mostly silent until the killer is present, which alerts us, the audience, to danger. It's all implemented masterfully, and we're given a sense of calm that conditions us to know that when the music plays, someone's in deep shit, and it also sets up so many scenes where you can suddenly get caught off guard. I love it. So Steve takes off, leaving the counselors to their own devices, while Annie gets picked up by an unseen person in a Jeep that looks surprisingly like Steve's Jeep, and that's because it is, but it's not supposed to be, because what did you expect on a budget like this? Things go south once Annie realizes that they passed a turn for the camp, and she's murdered in the woods after a quick chase. It kinda reminds me of Psycho, when the first half of the movie is centered around someone we're led to believe is the main character, and then it's suddenly shattered by them getting killed halfway through. It's a really simple and effective way to let us know that nobody in this movie is safe. The group is at the camp setting up the docks and screwing around while the killer watches them all from the woods across the lake, and then Ned pretends to drown just so he can kiss Brenda. Jesus Christ, Ned's a real pain in the ass, and he's also a fucking creep to boot. First he shoots an arrow at Brenda and nearly kills her, and then he fakes his own death just to cop a feel. Speaking of cops, a lone policeman shows up and questions the group about Crazy Ralph, who magically appears hiding in a closet minutes later and warns everyone that they're all doomed, just like Annie right before she was killed. Ned wanders off after realizing that nobody likes him, and then he's murdered off camera after following a hooded figure into a far-off cabin. And this is the first time that we actually get a chance to get a good look at the killer, and we all wore out our VCRs as kids hoping to pause it at exactly the right spot. Marcy and Jack wander up into the cabin that Ned was killed in to avoid a rainstorm and have some alone time while everyone else decides to sit around playing strip Monopoly. Jack is killed in one of the series' most iconic kills, and Marcy takes an axe right to the face in the bathroom. And this scene scared the shit out of me as a kid because a lot of the film's locations looked exactly like the summer camp that I went to as a kid. We also finally find out where Steve went off to, and it turns out he's been sitting on his ass in a diner all day, flirting with a waitress and complaining about how the kids he hired know absolutely nothing about being in the outdoors. And if that's the case, why did he leave or even hire him in the first place? Especially with the history that this place has. This guy's just a clueless asshole. Brenda's the next one to die when she's killed off camera, and Alice starts getting suspicious when lights start turning on and off and the phones are all out. Steve gets dropped off at the entrance to the camp by a police officer after getting his Jeep stuck in the mud, and here we actually get a really well done shot of Mr. Christie running up to the camp where he's accosted by the stalker with a flashlight, and right before he's killed, he tips the audience off that it's someone that he knows.
Oh, hi. What are you doing out in this mess?
Bill is the next one to disappear, and we're treated to an exciting scene of Alice making coffee. And to be honest, this is more of an educational film at this point. It teaches you to always check under your bed, don't accept rides from strangers, and how to make some really bitchin' coffee, which is something you're going to need to keep you awake through this entire scene. It's one continuous long shot that literally goes over 1 minute and 50 seconds. It's almost as long as a tracking shot in Goodfellas when they go in the back door of the Copacabana. The big difference between the two was that Goodfellas gave you background action and music, while in Friday the 13th, you're just sitting there in silence praying that she doesn't take cream in her coffee. Otherwise, it's going to be Monday the 16th by the time it cools down and she drinks the goddamn thing. But it's all one great big build-up for when Alice closes the door to the shed and discovers Bill stuck to the door with arrows and a slit throat. Holy shit, overkill much? Alice runs off and barricades herself in the cabin by piling everything she can get her hands on, and after tying the doorknob to the rafters, Brenda's body is thrown through the window, beginning a Friday tradition of someone crashing through a window in every movie. A Jeep pulls up, and Alice, thinking Steve has finally returned, moves all the crap from the door in record time, and this is when we're introduced to Pamela Voorhees, who's an old friend of the original camp owners. When they get inside, she tells Alice all about the trouble that the camp has gone through over the years, and we find out that she was working at the camp when her son drowned due to negligence. The more she tells the story, the more unhinged she becomes until she finally snaps and pulls a knife on Alice, revealing herself to be the killer. And honestly, this must have been quite a shock back in the day, because Betsy Palmer was a pretty well-known actress who appeared on TV in wholesome movies, and suddenly she's playing the psychotic killer. So shocking, in fact, that Siskel and Ebert publicly shamed her by doing the movie, and in a real scumbag move, gave away her home address, encouraging people to write her showing their disapproval for her choice in movies. And I always found it kind of funny how critical they were of exploitation films, considering that one of them wrote softcore pornography before they got famous. Think about that one. They have a quick struggle, and Alice gets the upper hand and she manages to escape, and in the final act of the film, we're treated to a great game of cat and mouse between the two, as Alice gets chased all over the campgrounds. I love this part right here when Pamela smashes a hole in the door to the pantry and gives Alice that sick smile. After knocking out Mrs. Voorhees with a frying pan, Alice goes to the beach where she's ambushed one last time, and this is when they really start beating the shit out of each other for real. Alice gains the upper hand for a brief moment, and Mrs. Voorhees is decapitated, and Alice is finally safe. This is probably the most shocking jump scare in the entire franchise, and it also started another Friday tradition where the ending is so ambiguous that fans have spent literally decades debating about what the endings mean and how their implications matter in the follow-up movies. The debate about the ending in this movie is whether or not Jason really jumped out of the lake and grabbed Alice, and personally, this is definitely a dream. Jason was thought to have drowned 23 years earlier, and if that was the case, Jason's body would have completely rotted away. And besides, there's two cops standing on the shoreline yelling at Alice, so if Jason really did jump out of the water and grab her, both of those cops would have seen it firsthand. The movie still holds up well, but not as well as the original Halloween. There's just too many moments where there's nothing really going on here. And yeah, it does do a fantastic job of building up the suspense, but it goes on for so long, and even the people that are convinced that something is going to happen give up, and then they start relaxing, and that's when something happens. And when cool stuff happens, it absolutely delivers. But one thing I felt they could have done better was apparently a much discussed idea, was that Mrs. Voorhees would have been a known character that we would have seen several times in the beginning. And yeah, I think it might have been way more shocking to see a killer go from being good to being bad, instead of just having a new character suddenly appear and, oh, by the way, I'm the killer. We already knew Mr. Christie was dead at this point. Knowing what happened to Annie earlier in the movie, just seeing this Jeep pull up kind of gave it away a bit early. Because at this point, Harry Harrison from CBS FM could have stepped out of that Jeep and we all would have guessed that he was the fucking killer. Now personally, I always felt that it might have been really interesting if Mrs. Voorhees went down to the camp just to sabotage the openings like she always had over the years, but watching Ned pretending to drown drove her over the edge completely to start killing people. But it's really not that big of a deal, because by today's standards, and even comparing it to its sequels, it's beyond tame. But it's still a good watch. Even if you don't like it, you gotta at least give it credit that for the time, it was able to accomplish enough to start a franchise. I definitely recommend checking this one out.